U.S. China tensions escalate into direct confrontation. In recent times, the ideological and economic battle between the United States and China could be likened to both sides digging trenches and erecting fortifications while launching large-scale aerial assaults. However, as of April 14, 2025, this conflict has entered a new phase of direct ground engagement, with hostilities becoming increasingly overt. For the first time, President Donald Trump publicly labeled China a hostile nation, specifically referring to it as one of the hostile trading nations. Meanwhile, reports have emerged that China secretly issued a classified directive ordering a comprehensive shift to a wartime state. What does this wartime state entail? At this stage, the core struggle revolves around influence over ASEAN nations, with Vietnam being the first to feel the impact. These countries form the frontline periphery of China's strategic sphere. On April 14th, Chinese President Xi Jinping made an official visit to Vietnam, raising questions about whether he can achieve his objectives and what the true stance of ASEAN nations toward the U.S. is at this moment. WorldView Today invites viewers to share their perspectives in the comments below. If you find this report insightful, please support us with a like, subscription, and comment to help us improve our programming. For those who wish to show further support, you can buy us a coffee via the link below. We sincerely thank you and look forward to engaging with you in our next analysis. Xi Jinping's Vietnam visit, a strategic move in the U.S. China showdown. The most significant development in the U.S. China rivalry is undoubtedly China's response, particularly Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam. On April 14th, Xi embarked on a three-nation Southeast Asia tour, with Vietnam as his first stop. This visit marks a critical step in China's efforts to secure trade transshipment routes and rally allies, a mission deemed non-negotiable. Vietnam extended a warm reception, with President Luong Quang personally greeting Xi at the airport. Xi held talks with General Secretary Talam and signed 45 bilateral cooperation agreements, pre-negotiated across sectors such as supply chains, artificial intelligence production, customs quarantine, agricultural trade, culture, sports, and media. The most substantive agreements include supply chain cooperation and Vietnam's acceptance of Chinese loans to construct 3 new railway lines connecting the two nations. However, details of the loan amounts and terms remain undisclosed. Vietnam also indicated it may consider approving licenses for China's COMAC aircraft, potentially opening its aviation market to Chinese manufacturers. On the surface, these developments suggest a strengthening of Sino-Vietnamese ties, with Chinese media hailing Xi's visit as a triumphant start. But is this truly the case? On April 14th, WorldView Today reported that China's stance has shifted from attempting to court Trump to adopting an uncompromising position against U.S. tariffs. Beijing has reportedly placed civilian government officials on a wartime footing, with personnel from the Foreign and Commerce Ministries ordered to cancel leave, keep phones on 24/7, and be ready to report at any moment. Agencies handling U.S. China issues have been instructed to bolster staff, including recalling officials who managed U.S. relations during Trump's first term. China has also launched a diplomatic campaign urging other nations to join in opposing U.S. tariffs. State media has been directed to intensify propaganda efforts, with Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning repeatedly invoking Mao Zedong's phrases, such as, "If they want to fight, we'll fight as long as it takes," and dismissing the U.S. as a paper tiger. These slogans, drawn from the Korean War era, underscore China's anti-American rhetoric. Additionally, China has recalled ambassadors and consuls from abroad for special meetings in Beijing to coordinate resistance to U.S. tariff measures. The Foreign Ministry sent letters to multiple countries, urging governments to ignore Trump's pressure and negotiate trade deals with China instead. China has also reached out to G20 nations, including some European countries, Japan, and South Korea, traditional U.S. allies, hoping to secure a joint statement supporting a multilateral trade system effectively a call to oppose U.S. policies. Internal reports reveal that, after Trump's election, China initially sought a mutually beneficial deal on issues like trade, TikTok, and even Taiwan. However, attempts to contact Trump's team, including through Ambassador Xi Feng to Elon Musk, Foreign Minister Wang Yi to Marco Rubio, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, were consistently rebuffed. Consequently, China has abandoned its earlier strategy of negotiation and adopted a hardline approach of retaliation and confrontation, aiming to fight to negotiate. This shift reflects a state of near panic, with China's strategy summed up as casting a wide net to cultivate influence, particularly among Southeast Asian neighbors. This urgency led to the convening of a so-called Neighborhood Diplomacy Work Conference, with Vietnam at the top of the list. Vietnam's balancing act, prioritizing U.S. interests. Why is Vietnam likely to prioritize U.S. demands? While the 45 agreements signed during Xi's visit appear comprehensive, their substantive value is limited. For instance, the railway projects are funded by Chinese loans. Agricultural trade primarily benefits Vietnam's exports to China, and AI cooperation is largely one-sided, with China providing technology. Vietnam notably refrained from endorsing Xi's remarks on the trade war, particularly his claim that there are no winners in a trade war. Moreover, Vietnam is expected to require Chinese firms to localize production, meaning Chinese investments must integrate into Vietnam's domestic economy. The U.S. remains Vietnam's most critical trade partner. In 2024, Vietnam's exports to the U.S. reached $119 billion, with imports of just $13 billion yielding a trade surplus of $106 billion. In contrast, Vietnam exported $61.2 billion to China, but imported $144 billion, resulting in an $82.8 billion trade deficit. Vietnam's $100 billion surplus with the U.S. far outweighs its $80 billion deficit with China, underscoring the U.S. as a VIP customer. To comply with U.S. demands, Vietnam tightly controls transshipment trade, while selectively opening its domestic market to China, such as through railway projects and COMAC licenses. This approach ensures China saves face, while the U.S. secures tangible benefits. Thus, Xi's Vietnam visit yielded some gains, but they fall short of China's strategic objectives. With China's current trajectory, rallying ASEAN nations to its side remains a distant goal. Even securing their neutrality, preventing them from aligning with the U.S. against China, is challenging. ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, appear to share a red line. Avoiding any actions that antagonize the U.S. Xi's three-nation tour is less an offensive to undermine U.S. influence and more a defensive effort to stabilize China's regional periphery, a critical distinction in China's strategic calculus. U.S. response. Trump's hardline stance. On the U.S. front, President Trump has taken decisive action, consistent with his confrontational style. On April 13th, he posted on Truth Social, fiercely criticizing China and, for the first time, explicitly calling it a hostile nation. His post highlighted three key points. First, no country can evade responsibility for unfair trade deficits and unprecedented tariff barriers, with China singled out as particularly egregious. Second, the recent electronics tariff exemptions were not an exception, as these products will face a 20% tariff under a different category, accusing mainstream media of spreading misinformation. Third, he emphasized scrutiny of semiconductor and electronics supply chains to prevent manipulation by hostile trading nations like China. The most significant takeaway is Trump's written designation of China as a hostile nation, revealing his true stance despite past rhetoric about his friendship with Xi. On April 13th, aboard Air Force One, Trump told reporters he would announce tariffs on imported semiconductors and hinted at flexibility for some companies, signaling potential shifts in electronics tariff exemptions. These swift adjustments reflect Trump's goal, not merely to offset trade deficits with short-term tariffs, but to restructure global supply chains, ensuring they move away from China, even if not immediately to the U.S. For instance, relocating Apple's supply chain entirely to the U.S. within 3 to 5 months is unrealistic, but shifting it to countries like India or Vietnam is feasible. On April 14th, Trump highlighted NVIDIA's production of an AI supercomputer in the U.S., showcasing the effectiveness of his policies. These actions suggest a prolonged trade war, dashing hopes of a quick resolution or return to pre-conflict stability. China's strategy, nationalism, and regional outreach. Xi's approach frames the U.S. as an assumed enemy, a tactic to deflect domestic economic woes by stoking nationalism. His Southeast Asia tour aims to bolster trade ties to offset the impact of U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports. However, the extent to which ASEAN nations will support China, particularly in trade, remains uncertain. While some may offer verbal commitments, their actions are likely to align with U.S. demands, as the U.S. is the region's largest buyer, a very important person in trade. China acknowledges this dynamic and is visibly concerned. While it lacks market leverage, China retains an edge in supply chains, as many products are either produced in China or prohibitively expensive elsewhere. For example, clothing production could shift to Malaysia or Bangladesh, but complex products like iPhones rely on China's integrated supply chain, where proximity and scale enable rapid assembly. Even Trump must contend with this reality: supply chain challenges and tariff exemptions. On April 12th, Bloomberg reported that U.S. Customs and Border Protection announced tariff exemptions for smartphones, laptops, hard drives, processors, and memory chips. Trump recognizes that taxing these products would spike prices. For instance, an iPhone priced at $850,100 could soar to $3,600 if sourced outside China, devastating the industry. Thus, exemptions were granted, with tariffs potentially capped at 20%. Of Chinese exports to the U.S., 70% are lithium batteries, smartphones, monitors, and gaming consoles, while over 90% of products like toasters, electric blankets, and alarm clocks are China-dependent. A complete decoupling would require rapid supply chain reconstruction, a concern for U.S. investors and markets. The trade war has already hurt tech firms, particularly in semiconductors, but the U.S. is pressuring suppliers to relocate to countries like India. Foxconn's Henan, China, facility exemplifies China's advantage: a large, low-cost labor pool in a less affluent province. Replicating this in the U.S., where high-density, low-cost labor is scarce, is impractical. India, with its population and lower costs, is emerging as a viable alternative. Apple has ramped up iPhone assembly in India, producing $22 billion worth in the year ending March 2025, a 60% increase from the prior year. This rapid shift suggests that, with determination, supply chains can relocate faster than anticipated, potentially stripping China of its leverage. China's resource gambit. On April 13th, the New York Times reported that China halted exports of critical minerals and magnets for automotive and semiconductor components, aiming to disrupt U.S. supply chains for cars, aviation, defense, and chips. This move seeks to inflict maximum pain on Trump's administration. China's calculation appears to be that it can endure economic hardship longer than the U.S., forcing concessions. However, the U.S. could source minerals elsewhere or accelerate domestic supply chain development, especially if China blocks transshipment routes. Maoist rhetoric and strategic missteps. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning invoked Mao Zedong's 1953 Korean War speech, signaling a willingness for a protracted conflict. However, this rhetoric may backfire. The Korean War ended shortly after Stalin's death, not due to Mao's resolve. Similarly, unforeseen events could derail Xi's strategy. China's hardline stance risks sparking domestic unrest, a variable requiring close observation. Conclusion: the U.S.-China trade war has entered a volatile phase, with both sides doubling down. Trump's aggressive tariffs and supply chain restructuring aim to reduce U.S. reliance on China, while Xi's regional outreach and resource restrictions seek to counter U.S. pressure. ASEAN nations, led by Vietnam, are navigating this rivalry by balancing diplomatic gestures toward China with economic alignment with the U.S. The outcome hinges on whether China can maintain its supply chain dominance and whether the U.S. can relocate production swiftly. For now, a return to pre-conflict stability seems unlikely. WorldView Today invites your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis valuable, please like, subscribe, and comment to support our work. For those inclined, you can buy us a coffee via the link below. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next report.